We have been studying Chapter 8 of the book, What is Man, Adam, Alien or Ape? And we come now to the final section of that chapter, in which we continue the previous podcasts in this series, in which we have sought to demonstrate that the study of fossil remains of men and apes does not tell us anything about the origin of the human species. We continue with references to a book by Dr. Lubinow, which adds further light to the things I have already said. Subheading: Jealously guarded bones. Our next problem is discussed at length by Marvin Lubinow in the opening chapter of his book, Bones of Contention, 2004, and I will not elaborate here except to quote a couple of extracts. Quote, "One would assume that those who have the proper academic credentials and are able to travel to where the original fossils are housed would have access to them. However, that is not always the case." Science writer Roger Lewin quotes Donald Johanson, the discoverer of Lucy, as agreeing that only those in the inner circle get to see the fossils, and only those who agree with the particular interpretation of a particular investigator are allowed to see the fossils. Lubinow continues, quotes, "The lack of access has important implications for the study of human origins. It means that paleoanthropology is in the strange situation of being a science in which most of its workers do not have access to the material upon which their science is based. Of course, plaster casts of these jealously guarded fossils are sometimes available, so why make a fuss about the originals being kept from view?" Lubinow gives an eye-opening reply. Less than half of the most important fossil material is available in the form of plaster casts, and there is a general feeling among PAs that casts should not be used as resource material for a scientific paper. A quote from Becky Sigman of Toronto University: "When a rare, indeed unique, exhibition of over 40 important original fossils was held in the American Museum of Natural History in New York in 1984, the precision mounts for the original fossils were prepared using plaster casts supplied in advance. But when the original fossils were placed in these mounts, most of them did not fit. Plaster casts are clearly no substitute for originals." Subheading: Carbon-14 dating. If you try carbon dating, you'll be disappointed. Carbon-14 is a radioactive form of carbon that is constantly being generated in the atmosphere as cosmic rays bombard nitrogen atoms. It is therefore called radiogenic carbon. These radiogenic carbon atoms react with oxygen to form carbon dioxide, which is then taken up by plants and enters the food chain. As a result, all living things incorporate the same small proportion of carbon-14 as is found in the atmosphere, about 1 part per trillion. However, its atmospheric concentration varies over time. It was, for example, doubled in the 1960s by atomic bomb tests, but has since dropped again by 1/3. When an organism dies, it stops taking up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and the radioactive carbon-14 it contains starts to decay in a predictable manner, reducing by half every 5,700 years. The carbon-14 remaining in a sample can therefore be measured and the time since death calculated. However, after about 40,000 years, the radiogenic carbon has virtually all gone, so the method cannot date anything older than that. There are also other possible problems arising from such things as bacterial action, water leaching, and sample contamination, which means that results may be inaccurate. There is finally the more basic difficulty for very old materials having to assume that ancient atmospheric concentrations of radiogenic carbon were similar to today's values. This is something we simply do not know. It is interesting that carbon-14 dates, even of pure carbon-containing materials like diamond, are often disputed on account of possible contaminations. Background radiation is another possible problem, and also instrumental errors. The chances of getting reliable dates from fossil bones are remote. So what do the carbon-14 results tell you about your discovery? Sadly, very little. Using this method, your skeleton appears to be only 3,000 years old. Bacteria may have been at work in the porous bone and have contributed more carbon-14 than the bone itself. The age is indeterminate. To be fair, recent work on carbon-14 dating of soft tissue from an extinct giant marine lizard claims that other tests show that the carbon-14 they measured is original and not due to contamination. But since the lizard is said to be more than 66 million years old, there shouldn't be any carbon-14 left to measure. Someone's interpretation has gone awry. Any better luck with the soil and stones associated with the skeletal find? Geologists tell you that the strata in the imaginary crumbling cliff where your imaginary find was found, that the strata come from the Cenozoic geological era, and that is represented by 66 million years ago to the present. But they warn you that a confusion of index fossils makes closer dating impossible. However, since your discovery is clearly a hominid of some kind, they are sure it must belong to the Holocene epoch, the last 12,000 years. You recognize that this is a somewhat circular argument, but you go along with it for want of anything better. After all, you have one more chance, the much more scientific technique of radiometric dating. Subheading: Radiometric dating. Although carbon-14 dating uses radioactivity to measure age, the term radiometric dating is normally reserved for methods used to determine the age of igneous rocks, rocks that have solidified from a molten state. An important proviso is that they must have remained impervious to water, which otherwise could falsify results by removing or infiltrating the trace elements that are fundamental to the technique. This dating method can't therefore be used to measure the age of either fossil bones or sedimentary rock deposited from water. Also, while carbon-14 dating measurements are only meaningful for geologically young materials, radiometric dating techniques, by contrast, are only effective for very ancient rocks. The most common dating technique for such rocks is the potassium-argon method. The element potassium, present in many rocks, has a radioactive form. This isotope, as it's called, is present at 0.0117% of total potassium and decays over time into either argon or calcium. The decay process is so slow that it would take 1.25 billion years for a sample of this potassium isotope to decay, with only 10.9% of the decay events resulting in the formation of argon atoms rather than of calcium. Argon is a gas, and the method assumes that any of this substance initially present in the molten rock will escape rapidly once it reaches the open air. So when a rock solidifies, for example, when volcanic lava cools and hardens, it should contain no argon, and any of the gas formed subsequently in the rock is assumed to have arisen by radioactive decay of potassium. But accurately measuring both the potassium and argon contents of the rock, therefore, researchers can calculate the time since solidification. This is what is meant by the age of a rock. There are, however, a significant number of problems. Firstly, potassium compounds are highly soluble in water, so that potassium can be lost even from apparently solid rock. Secondly, the assumption that no argon is present in newly solidified rocks may be false, because the gas could be picked up from the atmosphere. Alternatively, argon initially present in the molten rock may not escape before the rock solidifies. To test the reliability of potassium-argon dating, geologist Andrew Snelling collected 13 samples of lava formed during eruptions of the Mount Connector of a particular volcano in New Zealand in 1949, 1954, and 1975. Without revealing that the rocks had solidified so recently, he sent the samples to a respected commercial dating Organization, Geochron Laboratories in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where they were dated by the potassium-argon method. The following results were reported. 4 samples were found to be, quotes, less than 270,000 years old. 1 sample was less than 290,000 years old. 1 was dated at 800,000 years old. 3 were dated as 1 million years old. 1 was 1.2 million years old. 1 was 1.3 million years old. 1 was 1.5 million years old. And the last sample was dated at 3.5 million years old. The margin of error in all cases was given as a plus or minus 20%. To be absolutely clear, there was nothing wrong with the laboratory's measurements. The problem lay in the assumptions made about the amounts of argon and potassium present in the volcanic magma when it solidified into lava. This doesn't mean that other methods of radiometric dating might or might not have given more accurate results. All it tells us is that these methods always involve assumptions that cannot be verified. For expert readers, this also applies to so-called isochron methods, which claim to eliminate such assumptions, but where obviously false dates have also been obtained. Subheading: Tools and Artifacts. African tribes and rainforest denizens tend to settle their disputes with machetes and blowpipes, rather than guided missiles and helicopter gunships. In that sense, they are more primitive than the Pentagon. But that doesn't mean they belong to a lower species of humanity. This primitive weaponry tells us nothing about the biological nature of their owners. Taken from their cultural surroundings and given an education, they may be perfectly capable of matching the skills of modernity. So tools found or not found with fossil remains don't really tell us anything about human origins. Subheading: Finding Fred. That's our imaginary skeletal find in the story that I told to help us understand the problems of dating skeletons and fossils. Finding Fred, a place in the family tree. Let's begin with a cautionary quote from Henry G., editor of the scientific journal Nature. Quotes, "We have all seen the canonical parade of apes, each one becoming more human. We know that as a depiction of evolution, this lineup is tosh, that is, nonsense. Yet we cling to it. Ideas of what human evolution ought to have been like still colour our debates. In evolutionary thinking, the family tree that concerns us here consists of a trunk representing the unknown common ancestor of all ape-like creatures, including man, and main branches, each of which represents a major division among hominids. Then secondary branches sprouting out from the main branches represent subdivisions of these major groups, and so on, until one reaches the outer envelope of the tree's leafy canopy. Obviously, all extant species like modern man, chimpanzee, gorilla, orangutan, and so on, will be found on the outer envelope. They are the outermost twigs of the tree of evolution. But where do you put fossilized creatures that have no modern counterpart? It depends entirely on your theory of descent. An extinct species will still belong among the outermost twigs if it was not ancestral to any extant species. On the other hand, if it was ancestral to a modern species, it belongs deeper in the canopy, with its descendants and their descendants moving progressively outward till they reach the outer envelope. How can anyone tell whether Fred was an ancestor of modern chimpanzees or modern humans, or was simply home alone, an evolutionary dead end with no known antecedents and no known descendants? The age of a fossil, even if it is known, does not solve this dilemma. If modern chimpanzees suddenly went extinct, they wouldn't become candidates for human ancestry just because they died out and humans didn't. Yet, if PAs are still in business 1,000 years hence, they might easily classify the extinct chimps as human ancestors because of their early demise. It's quite possible. After all, many PAs think that the last common ancestor of chimps and humans was rather like a chimp. Again, for many years, Neanderthals were thought to be ancestors of modern man, until it was shown that they interbred with Homo sapiens and must have coexisted with them. The arrangement of hominid fossils in an evolutionary family tree, with one branch leading ultimately to man, requires many assumptions. Some will no doubt argue that there are early hominid fossils, but no early human fossils. So man must have come on the scene more recently than apes. But this may not be the case. If, for whatever reason, human populations were historically small, they may have left no trace in the fossil record during earlier times. But if man did arise later than apes, that doesn't mean that they descended from them. The belief that they did assumes rather than proves an evolutionary relationship. So, with apologies for another quotation, I will finish this chapter with one more example. Jeffrey H. Schwartz, professor of biological anthropology at the University of Pittsburgh, writing in Newsweek on the 9th of October 2015, explains the case of a recently discovered fossil. Quotes, "Enter the newly announced species Homo naledi, which is claimed to be our direct ancestor because it has features of Australopiths and Homo. Why is it a species of Homo? Because some specimens seem to be like us. Why Australopith? Because other specimens have some of their features. Why do all belong to the same species? Because they were found in the same cave. But the published images tell a different story. Viewed from the side, two partial skulls are low and long, with a long, gently sloping forehead that flows smoothly into the brow, nothing like us. Professor Schwartz goes on in similar vein, considering differences among the remains between teeth and leg bones, before asking, quotes, what to do, close quotes. Declaring that Homo's taxonomy has become a confused mess, he calls on the PA community to restudy the human fossil record without its current commitment to preconceived ideas. Perhaps, quotes, dem bones, close quotes, should be rephrased dumb bones. They certainly have very little to tell us about human origins.